Mafia bosses are widely known to live a life of luxury, often owning fortunes that are never accounted for. But what happens when their empire comes crashing down? Paul Vario lost millions after the Lufthansa heist fallout. Michael Franzese walked away from crime and eventually paid the price, and a 5-year-long revolution stripped Meyer Lansky of his billion-dollar assets. This is a compilation of mafia bosses who gained unimaginable wealth but ultimately lost it all in the end. Their stories prove that in organized crime, the fall is always harder than the rise. Let's get started. Santo Trafficante Jr. He was the son of mafia boss Santo Trafficante Sr., who was a Florida mobster and leader of a powerful mafia crime family based in Tampa. The Trafficante crime family is rumored to be involved in the killing of President John F. Kennedy and the leader of revolutionary Cuba, Fidel Castro. In 1946, Santo was sent to Cuba to invest in the growing number of nightclubs and casinos in the island nation. At this time, he was already an underboss of the crime family. Santo helped his family form a strong alliance with the Batista government in Cuba. He operated the Sanssouci and the Casino International gambling establishments in Cuba during the rule of ex-dictator Fulgencio Batista. However, in 1959, disaster struck. The Cuban Revolution overturned the corrupt Batista government, and Fidel Castro, who was the rebel leader at the time, nationalized foreign-owned properties. This caused several casinos to also shut down. It was reported that after Batista fled the country, angry crowds poured into the casinos and destroyed everything inside. This was a huge financial blow to Trafficante and his crime family as the mafia boss lost his offshore casinos. Santo's huge financial loss caused many to believe that he later formed an alliance with the CIA in an effort to assassinate Castro, an alleged move that resulted in intense law enforcement scrutiny. Interestingly, despite the violence of Florida's mob wars and the various conspiracy theories about Castro's attempted murder, Santo never served jail time. But while Santo got away, this next mafia boss didn't get so lucky. Civella. Civella was the leader of the Kansas City crime syndicate. In 1981, he was indicted in Kansas City on charges of conspiring and skimming of gambling receipts at a Las Vegas casino. Civella reportedly had a special likeness for Las Vegas, something his lawyer thought was purely born out of his love for pork necks served at an Italian restaurant in town. Unknown to him, Civella wasn't just there for the food. He was also involved in some illegal casino businesses in Las Vegas. The mafia boss reportedly received tens of thousands of dollars each month in illegal cash deliveries from his criminal associates who were skimming untaxed money from casino winnings. Mob bosses allegedly used these payouts to help casino owners obtain construction loans from a Teamsters pension fund. Eventually, Civella was indicted for a skim at the Tropicana Hotel Casino on the Las Vegas Strip. He had initially been sentenced to 4 years in prison in 1980 for conspiring to bribe a prison warden to arrange a transfer of his nephew from a federal prison to a minimum security prison in Fort Worth. This came after a report by the Federal Bureau of Investigation identified Civella as the leader of the Kansas City crime syndicate. The report stated that the mob boss held the ultimate power and as such should be considered accountable for his actions. After his indictment, Civella allegedly lost control of family assets, and this led to a major financial downturn for the mob boss. This next mafia boss also had a similar story. Paul Vario. A mafia boss in the Lucchese crime family, Paul Vario was the leader of a crew that carried out several heists at the JFK International Airport during the 1960s and 1970s. His criminal associates would extort money from shippers and airlines in exchange for labor peace. Two of his notable crew members were Thomas DeSimone and Henry Hill. In his early days as the Lucchese crime boss, Vario conducted most of his criminal business from an old German bar and a junkyard. There he oversaw criminal operations that included hijackings, loan sharking, bookmaking, and fencing of stolen property. These businesses made him a fortune, even though his reign did not last for long. In 1984, Vario was sent to prison after his lieutenant Henry Hill turned the government against him. Hill ventured into drug trafficking against Vario's command, and in fear of being killed by his boss, he joined the Witness Protection Program and testified against the mafia boss. Vario was eventually convicted of defrauding the federal government. He lost all of his wealth after the conviction, and later died in prison in Texas in 1988. Just like Vario, this next person also lost his fortune in an unfortunate way. Anthony Carallo. Carallo was known to mobsters and federal agents as Tony Ducks because of his ability to duck subpoenas and convictions. He was described as an old-time Don who could stake his reputation on his word. Although not much is known about Carallo's net worth, reports have it that he was heavily involved in illicit businesses like gambling, loan sharking, truck hijacking, and labor racketeering. These businesses were the source of his fortune until his arrest in 1985. A year after this, he was found guilty on federal racketeering charges at a mass trial that led to the conviction conviction of top crime leaders. He was given a 100-year sentence and also lost a significant portion of his wealth due to fines and asset seizures. Anthony Carallo died years later in prison at the age of 87. While Carallo couldn't make it out of prison, this next mafia boss had a better chance. Joseph Armone. Armone, popularly called Joe Piney, was an American mobster in the Gambino crime family. In the early days of his criminal career, Armone followed his brother into the Mangano family and became one of the family's major earners. He was an associate of Joseph Biondo, who controlled a part of the family's heroin smuggling network. Biondo was once mentioned in the attempted assassination of Anastasia, the crime family boss. On October 1, 1964, Armone and 11 other family mobsters were indicted in what became the French Connection case. All 12 were accused of transporting $20 million worth of heroin from France to the United States using sailors, businessmen, and a diplomat as drug couriers. This incident happened between 1956 to 1965. Similarly, in December 1987, Armone was also convicted on charges of racketeering conspiracy involving extortion, bribery, and illegal interstate travel. The bribery charge involved a plot to bribe a government official to transfer the son of Gambino consigliere Joseph Gallo from a New York State prison to a federal prison. The bribe offer was about $20,000. On February 22, 1988, Armone was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and was fined $820,000. Although he was later acquitted, this incident became a huge blow to his finances. While Armone was able to avoid a long prison sentence, this next mafia boss still remains in confinement to this day. Vincent Basano. Basano became acting boss of the Bonanno crime family after the arrest of Joseph Massino. During his criminal career, he faced multiple charges including racketeering, attempted murder, and even murder. In 2004, the mafia boss was arrested and convicted of running illegal gambling. In August 2007, he was also convicted of murdering a guy, Santoro, who tried to kidnap his son. Initially in 2004, former Bonanno boss Joseph Massino turned state's evidence and reported that Basano had conspired to kill a prosecutor named Greg Andres. However, at that time, there was no evidence to back the claim. Later on, Massino was able to extract an unambiguous confession from Basano. Although he was unable to get evidence to convict the mafia boss for Andre's murder, he did record Basano freely admitting to ordering the murder of Randolph Pizzolo, who was also a member of the crime family. In 2011, Basano was eventually convicted of ordering the murder of Pizzolo and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He consequently lost all his fortune and is currently serving his sentence at United States Penitentiary, Coleman. Just like Basano, this next mafia lord also lost his fortune after a murder case. James Marcello. During the early and mid-2000s, James Marcello became famous for running criminal operations in the United States. He was the boss of the Chicago Outfit criminal organization and was involved in the family's criminal escapades. Marcello was once convicted on racketeering charges and also for running bookmaking, street tax, and juice loan operations in western Cook County and in DuPage County. On April 5, 1995, he was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison, but after only 8 years, the mafia boss was released and he returned to his home in Lombard, Illinois. In April 2005, Marcello was once again indicted, and this time with his younger half-brother Michael Marcello. The duo were indicted on murder and racketeering charges. Marcello was accused of murdering Nicholas D'Andrea, Anthony Spilotro, and Michael Spilotro. He was also accused of attempting to kill Nicholas Cirillo Sr. in 1982. But here's the thing, Marcello was a rich mafia boss, so shortly after his indictment, he attempted to be released on bond, offering to put up homes worth $12.5 million as bond. This included a $9 million house in Oak Brook, a house in Palace Hills which was owned by his son James Marcello Jr., a summer house in Michigan City, a farm in McHenry County, and 2 homes in Long Beach, Indiana. Marcello also offered to permit law enforcement officials to intercept his telephone calls. However, despite all of this, a district judge denied his request to be released on bond. He was eventually sent to jail and lost most of his assets. While Marcello appeared to have lost his influence only after going to prison, this next mafia boss got kicked out of the gang. Joey Merlino. Merlino is a former prominent American mobster and boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He's a prominent figure who has had a complex legal and criminal history. In the early days of his criminal career, Merlino quickly rose to power and seized control of the Philadelphia crime family after fighting against one of its factions. He led the crime family in gambling, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and extortion, constantly raking in profits from these illegal businesses. Merlino was different from many other mafia bosses. He interacted regularly with the media and the public, often providing charity and hosting events for people in Philadelphia. In 2001, the Mafia boss was convicted of several RICO charges, including racketeering, illegal gambling, and extortion. He was also sentenced to 14 years in prison. Following his release from prison in 2011, Merlino reportedly stayed in Florida and invested in various business ventures, including a restaurant. He was eventually demoted in 2024 and allegedly expelled from the Philadelphia Mafia. While Merlino was expelled from the crime family, this next person left on his own free will. Michael Franzese. From mafia boss to motivational speaker, the story of Michael Franzese is one that exemplifies a drastic fall from power. Michael Franzese is a former American mobster who was a boss in the Colombo crime family in New York City. He reportedly dropped out of school after his father, Sonny Franzese, also a mob boss, was sentenced to 50 years in prison for bank robbery. In the early 1980s, Franzese and his colleagues implemented a scheme to defraud the federal government out of gasoline taxes. This scheme reportedly made him up to $8 million per week. The Mafia boss built wealth, so much that at the age of 35, Fortune magazine listed him as number 18 on its list of the 50 most wealthy and powerful Mafia bosses. However, in 1986, the story changed. Franzese pleaded guilty to 1 count of racketeering conspiracy and 1 count of tax conspiracy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison on conspiracy charges and ordered to pay $14.7 million in restitution on the federal charges. Franzese also agreed to sell his assets, including a mansion in Old Brookville, New York, and his Miami Gold production company. Although he was eventually released in 1989, he was once again arrested for a parole violation. The Mafia boss was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for violating the probation requirements from his 1989 release. However, after he was let go in 1994, Franzese decided to turn away from crime. He walked away from the mob and retired to California. He also became a motivational speaker, commentator, and writer. While it's generally known that Franzese lost his fortune to hefty fines and court cases, the wealth of this next Mafia boss could not be accounted for. Al Capone. He was once considered one of the richest mobsters, a mafia boss at the top of his game. From a very young age, Alphonse Gabriel Capone showed a tendency for criminal behavior. After getting expelled from school, he joined local street gangs and began his short-lived career in crime. According to a government report, Capone's criminal gang was making approximately $50 million a year from illegal liquor. They made $25 million from gambling and about $10 million from drugs and prostitution during the mid-1920s. It's said that at the peak of his career, Al Capone's net worth hovered around $100 million. This is approximately worth about $1.5 billion today. However, he didn't have all this wealth to himself. From devious hijackers to crooked cops and corrupt politicians, well, everyone took their cut. And by the time Capone ended up in prison, he had hefty court fines and back taxes to deal with. But that's not even the shocking part. While Capone made millions during his crime days, after his death, all of his fortune was nowhere to be found. While some say he probably lost everything, others speculate that the Mafia boss has his money spread out in different banks and hidden in lockboxes in different places. While law enforcement could not account for Capone's wealth, this next Mafia boss forfeited all he had even after becoming an FBI informant. Joseph Massino. Massino was an American mobster, a member of the Mafia, and boss of the Bonanno crime family. By the late 1960s, Massino was a Bonanno associate. He led a successful truck hijacking crew with the assistance of his brother-in-law Salvatore Vitale and a carjacker Dwayne Leisenheimer. He was also friends with another mob hijacker, John Gotti, who later became a Gambino crime family boss. At the peak of his career, Massino made massive wealth. He opened his own catering company, which eventually became another front for his activities. In July 2004, the Mafia boss was convicted in a RICO case following testimony made by Salvatore Vitale. At that time, he was also facing the death penalty for a separate murder accusation. So in order to avoid the death sentence, Massino agreed to testify against his former associates. He allegedly did so in hopes of sparing his life. Massino was the first sitting boss of a New York crime family to turn state's evidence, and the second in the history of the American Mafia to do so. He testified twice for the government, including helping to win a murder conviction against his acting boss, Vincent Basano, in 2011. At the end, Massino was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was fined over $10 million and made to forfeit his restaurants. Massino also turned in a cash of $7 million and hundreds of gold bars, both of which were kept in his Howard Beach home. Just like Massino, this next Mafia boss also had a similar story. Vito Genovese. He was a top don who was instrumental in the Italian mob's rise in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s. Vito lived in 3 different homes along the Bayshore. In 1937, he began an 8-year exile in Italy as he fled prosecution for murder. A year after returning from Italy, the Mafia boss purchased a house in Atlantic Highlands and spent $250,000 only on renovations. This is worth about $3.7 million today. According to Vito's wife Anna, the Mafia boss was making $20,000 a week from an illegal lottery in New York City. He also claimed to have made $120 a week as a scrap paper dealer. On July 7, 1958, Vito was indicted on charges of conspiring to import and sell narcotics. He was implicated by a colleague in a drug deal, and a Puerto Rican drug dealer also claimed to have met with him. On April 4, 1959, the Mafia boss was convicted in New York of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. He was sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Although later released, Vito suffered a huge financial loss as a result of his indictment. While Vito lost most of his assets after being convicted, this next person gave up on the Mafia life. Salvatore Bonanno. In 1963, Salvatore's father, Joseph Bonanno, conspired with Profaci family boss Joseph Magliocco to assassinate their other 3 rivals: the Gambino crime family boss Carlo Gambino, Lucchese crime family boss Gaetano Lucchese, and Buffalo crime family boss Stefano Magaddino. In October 1964, Joseph was kidnapped off the streets of New York, and during his 2-year absence, Salvatore took over. Seeing an opportunity in Joseph's absence, Bonanno mobster Gaspar Di Gregorio took advantage of the family's discontent over Salvatore's role and tried to claim family leadership. He started a revolt that led to the Banana War, a 4-year period of strife within the Bonanno family. In 1968, after a heart attack, Salvatore's father ended the war by agreeing to retire as boss and move to Arizona. Salvatore himself also resigned and moved out of New York with his father. While Salvatore resigned voluntarily, this next Mafia boss was forced into retirement. Frank Costello. Costello was a major American gangster. In 1931, after the death of crime bosses Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the Mafia boss became his syndicate's political link, taking over its businesses. Costello was a close associate of Lucky Luciano, another crime boss who was noted for his influence with politicians. He gathered interests in Las Vegas gambling casinos and socialized with New York politicians and businessmen. However, despite his influence, Costello had a long legal battle with the U.S. government. He also faced multiple convictions and even survived an assassination attempt. In 1915, the Mafia boss went to prison for a year for carrying a concealed weapon. After his release, he branched into bootlegging and gambling operations in New York, Florida, Louisiana, and other states. This move gave him a lot of fortune, but still did not stop his legal battles with law enforcement. In 1946, Costello was deported to Italy, after which he was forced into retirement. While he still tried to provide leadership for New York rackets, his role was only limited to advice and arbitration of disputes. He was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the syndicate. Similar to how Costello retired from crime, this next Mafia boss also maintained a low profile at the end of his career. Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese was one of the founding fathers of the American Mafia. He was a well-connected and widely respected godfather whose name remains the identity of one of New York's 5 crime families. Lucchese started his career during the Prohibition and kept power through the mid-20th century. By his 20s, the mob boss had joined forces with Charles Luciano, another mob boss, and together they carried out several criminal activities. The crime family that now bears Lucchese's name was first called the Gagliano family, named after the syndicate's inaugural boss at the time. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, Lucchese solidified his power by ruling over the lucrative textile trade. And when Gagliano died of natural causes in 1951, Lucchese took his place as boss. He kept a low profile, making money and garnering considerable power in the shadows. Lucchese managed to avoid the headlines for more than 30 years before his death on July 13, 1967. Although he maintained a low profile, it is alleged that the Mafia boss had lost his power and wealth even before his death. While Lucchese didn't lose his wealth to crime cases, the story was quite different for this next Mafia boss. Meyer Lansky. Lansky was one of the most powerful and richest crime syndicate bosses and bankers in the United States. He had major interests in gambling, especially in Florida, Cuba, Las Vegas, and the Bahamas. In the 1920s, his gang was involved in burglaries, liquor smuggling, and other rackets. At the time, Lansky worked together with mob boss Giuseppe Masseria, and together they developed a squad of professional murderers for hire. By 1936, Lansky had begun to develop gambling operations in Florida and New Orleans. He also operated in Cuba, where he arranged payoff layoffs to Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. However, after the Cuban Revolution began and Fidel Castro came to power, Lansky turned to the Bahamas, building casinos on Grand Bahama and Paradise Island. He also extended his gambling empire to other areas of the Caribbean and even across the Atlantic to London. Lansky was involved in a lot of criminal activities. He was involved in narcotics smuggling, pornography, prostitution, labor racketeering, and extortion. He also controlled some legitimate enterprises like hotels, golf courses, and a meatpacking plant. The Mafia boss made so much money that by 1970, his total holdings were estimated at $300 million. However, his jolly days were soon over after he was convicted of contempt of a grand jury. Although most of his indictments were later abandoned, Lansky was reportedly forced into exile in Israel and all his assets were seized. But here's something you might find interesting. Although on paper it was stated that Lansky was worth almost nothing at the time of his death, the FBI believed he still had millions in a hidden bank account. Lansky wasn't the only one who suffered significant loss. Even his crime partner suffered the same fate. Lucky Luciano. He is regarded as the father of modern organized crime in the United States. Luciano created modern American organized crime in 1931 after arranging a hit on his own boss. He established the Commission in 1931 to unite the 5 major New York crime families and the Mafia's criminal empire nationwide. Luciano majorly became wealthy in the bootlegging business during Prohibition. He came to power after the assassination of New York Mafia boss Salvatore Bonanno, an incident he orchestrated after learning that Bonanno planned to have him killed. In the early 30s, Luciano's crime family began taking over New York's organized prostitution. This made him extremely wealthy and powerful, although not for long. Luciano's life took a tragic turn in 1935 after Eunice Carter, a social worker turned lawyer, was appointed assistant district attorney. She connected Luciano to several prostitution charges, which led to his arrest in 1936. The Mafia boss was found guilty on a series of prostitution charges. He was convicted of more than 60 counts of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. This was the longest sentence in history for compulsory prostitution. After Luciano got into prison, he permitted his friend Frank Costello to assume his position as head of the commission while he gave orders from behind bars. Later on, Luciano faced a bail hearing, and his bail was set at $350,000, which obviously was an exorbitant amount at that time. Although he was eventually released, Luciano was deported to Italy, a punishment that stripped him of his US-based assets. But he wasn't the only one who suffered such fate. This next Mafia boss also lost his assets. Philip Rastelli. Rastelli was a Mafia boss from the Bonanno crime family. He was heavily involved in loan sharking, extortion, and drug trafficking activities even before joining the Bonanno crime family. He also had a lunch wagon business which fetched him significant income. Rastelli's doom started after his marriage began to fail. His wife, Connie, learned of his affairs and told federal agents that her husband was a drug trafficker. But here's the thing, Connie was not always against her husband. In fact, she had previously tried to save him from jail. In 1953, Rastelli and an associate allegedly shot Michael Russo. The victim survived the shooting, and over the next year, Connie repeatedly approached Russo's wife with an offer of $5,000, asking her not to identify Rastelli as the shooter. After Connie exposed Rastelli to law enforcement, the Mafia boss was arrested on a parole violation for associating with persons engaged in criminal activity. He was first indicted along with other Cosa Nostra leaders in the famous Mafia Commission trial, but later on, he was convicted on 24 counts of labor racketeering and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Rastelli's conviction caused him to lose his family assets, even though many claim he still went back to power. The Mafia world is heavily plagued with uncertainty. While many of these Mafia bosses once ruled the underworld, their power and influence came crashing down in just a matter of years. What are your thoughts on their stories? Let me know in the comment section. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then be sure to click on this next card on your screen.